today at the Digital Greenhouse. For those of you who've not met me before, I'm Lucy Kirby, I'm the director here. But looking around the room, lots of very familiar faces. Welcome to those of you joining us on the live stream today as well. Just a couple of very boring housekeeping things from me to begin with, not for those of you on live stream. If we're not expecting any fire alarms today, if the fire alarms do go off, the fire exit is just to the side here. You would assume that we've got two coffee and fire facilities just through the doors. Okay. So today is our first data-driven Wellbeing event. We are really pleased to have a fantastic event this week. And this morning we will be joined by Matthew Bell and Adrian Lewis for 20 minutes. And we have Deputy Sasha Kansaluna. If you haven't yet joined Slido, please do download that by pointing your phones to the screen. We'll be using that for questioning. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Data Week on this breezy but bright morning. So you've done the right thing to come here in person, because the wonders of also physical networking are really fantastic. So we are at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution. First, we had the steam engine, then science and mass production, followed by the rise of digital technology. But today, the next industrial phase is very much driven by the cloud, by mobile, by Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. So on average, 1.7 megabytes of data are created every second by every individual on the planet on average. That's, my Google search says, is 74 zettabytes of data that will be created in 2021. By comparison, there was only about 2 zettabytes created of data in 2010, so just over 10 years ago, 30 times less. Hands up and an extra croissant for anyone who knows how many zeros a zettabyte has. No? Bit higher than that, Rob? Any other takers? Yeah, so it's 21 zeros, so 10 to the power of 21. I mean, we're talking about crazy amounts of data. So data is everywhere, and it's driving really everything. And when I worked in Google, we could not launch any campaign unless we could monitor their effectiveness so that we could scale those campaigns nationally and globally. When I worked in Agoda, a sister company of Booking.com, the largest hotel booking site and travel company in the world right now, you could not make any changes to the website without what we then called A/B testing. Each tiny change of the design of a button, positioning of a link, or a launch of any major feature or functionality would need to be statistically proven to increase click-through rates. And famously, the CEO at the time wanted hotel images to be larger, but the A/B testing clearly showed that smaller images actually led to higher click-through rates on average. And marginal improvements of 1%, 2%, 3% conversion rates on the website would result in millions of dollars of additional revenue. So we fast forward to this year, and data conversations have never been more important. In fact, it's often the most important asset of any business. Social media sites are able to provide us with free services because they mine zettabytes of data and then effectively sell advertising back to us. But collecting data is hard, especially when you're playing a catching up game. Manual and ad hoc collection of information is simply not fit for purpose for the 21st century. And the data-driven world requires a data-literate workforce. So upskilling to design, manage, and interpret data systems is really critical, which is why we need to have a digital and data-driven design of future products and services and ensure we have skills in this area as well. So as the digital transformation of the Guernsey government is slowly but surely underway, we must place data at the core of the design of its infrastructure and services. So why is it important? Well, if we don't put data first, we simply risk the livelihood of our community, economy, and environment. You might say it's a bit dramatic, but for example, in Guernsey, we don't have a central depository of patient healthcare records. Information is scattered around databases of service providers such as GPs, Princess Elizabeth Hospital, schools, and so on. So when the vaccination rollout took place, these databases had to be pulled together, and they are compiled differently. They have different data sets. And so was the reason why we saw certain discrepancies which arose in terms of who was vaccinated when. If we don't have the information about our marine and wildlife habitat, we don't know how well or bad Guernsey might be doing in terms of climate change, habitat loss, and steps required to mitigate those problems. If we don't keep track of the qualifications, skills, and training islanders have right now, how can we plan for a future workforce that will undergo tremendous changes from digitization and automation? But with the dawn of the data-driven information society comes much bigger responsibility. Inappropriate use of our data can lead to fraud, criminal activity, identity theft, online child abuse, fake news, and media manipulation. Ultimately, a threat to our democracy, our social, mental, and economic well-being. This is why protective legislation, such as GDPR and cybersecurity, are critical enablers for safeguarding this age of the information society. So the question of who should own our data and how it's managed is central to this conversation. This is why, if you look at the current digital strategy of the Estonian government, a jurisdiction that is well known for pioneering national digital transformation, it has the following goal. It's the creation of a well-functioning and secure environment for using and creating ICT solutions in Estonia. And this aim is achieved by twin goals of enabling the development of the information society and services, but as well as development of cybersecurity. So without such security and safeguarding, digital and data revolution can present the largest threat to our civilization we ever had. So Lucy and her team have put a fantastic week of events for our community and industry to attend. So thank you for being here again. And I hope you will join, learn, and take the insights and connections from this week into your life, business, and community. And so I'm delighted to open this week and today's event and introduce to you Adrian Lewis and Matthew Bell from Frontier Economics as today's keynote speakers. Adrian has a lot of experience in the bailiwick public services, having been chief executive of the state of Alderney, as well as chief secretary and officer of multiple committees in the Guernsey government. And Matthew Bell is director of public policy at Frontier Economics, non-executive director at the Energy Saving Trust, and has previously also been the CEO of the CCC, the famous CCC, the Committee for Climate Change in the UK. So I pass it over to you.
Shaping your future, and your future prosperity can be changed and can be influenced by the use of data, converting that into evidence, and then taking action as a result. Now, data comes in many forms, and I always find it easier to draw analogies and to make comparisons with things. And actually, data to me is a bit like this. This bag of flour. I haven't really got a table to put it on, so it might fall off. If it does, bear with me. That's some dried milk. I've got some sugar. And I've got some yeast, and I'm sure I've got something. I got some salt. Here we are, some good little stuff here. Now, actually, within there, you've got granules, you've got grains, you've got powders, you've got bits and pieces. Imagine grains and granules a bit like data. Lots of little things all over the place, but they've all got different attributes. And actually, if I put all that into a big bowl, chuck some water in, mixed it around with a bit of oil, you'd end up with a bit of a sloppy mess. And no matter what I did with it, it'd still be a bit sloppy. So you have to do something more with data. You can't, it's in pockets all over the place. But actually, to make it useful, you need to say, what happens if I do certain things with it? And that's where you get to say, well, okay, what happens if I mix this with this? And let's look at past experience of mixing together ingredients, and you get to a certain product. And that's where you get to my next useful tool is actually a recipe book. Because what you do is actually, you know, if you mix in certain ways, the evidence will show you that you get this result. Now, my analogy for frontier economics is actually, it's a bit like a recipe writer. I'm going to check this with Matthew, so he might not agree with me, but actually, in essence, Frontier, been around about 20 years, probably one of Europe's leading microeconomics consultancy firms. But what it does, it writes recipes. It takes the data and says, well, okay, if we got data in certain pockets, and we know that in a certain circumstance, you apply these things to it, you will end up with this result. They then present to clients and say, well, okay, if you, in your circumstances, if you want this particular outcome, mix this with this and cook it together, and you'll end up with, hopefully, the final product, which is one I made earlier, which is my loaf, because these are generally ingredients for making bread. That's a real loaf, but I can't boast all of it. It's in bread maker, but that's pretty good, actually. If you want one afterwards, you can rip a piece off, because I haven't brought a knife with me. But let me put it on somewhere you can see it. I'm very proud of that one. That's my loaf, bear with me. Anyway, so we've got the ingredients, we've got the product. Now, actually, oops, just bear with me, I'll get my notes. When I was, Lucy and I had the opportunity last week to go on the radio, on Radio Guernsey. And one of the first questions they posed to us was, what is data science? It's a really good question. And it's a really big topic. And actually, you ponder over it. And because on the radio, thankfully, Lucy came to my aid, because you need a quick answer. And it's sometimes easier to think of other sciences. So if we talk about computer science, or you talk about medical science, or you talk about sports science or environmental science, we probably understand it a lot more quickly than we do about data science. Because in sports science, and I'm not a sports scientist, but you can understand that they look at actually the component parts of an athlete's performance. And they run at a certain pace, but somehow they seem to wane after a certain period of time. Or if their nutrition is down, that actually that affects their performance. So what science will say, well, okay, if I know that X and Y put together gives me that, if I change the combination, so for the athlete, if I stop him or her running at a certain pace and slow for a period, then sprint and do something else, or I change their diet, I can change their performance. Well, you think that's basically, so data science is looking at the data and changing understanding what happens in certain circumstances to change the outcome. And the beauty of data science is actually, it's in all the other sciences. So if you want to understand how to make effective outcomes in any area of science, you will need to analyze data. Now, my daughter Rosie, she's doing her final year at Manchester University, and last week she sent to me her dissertation and said, Dad, can you proofread it? Well, it had the really snappy title of, and I might get this wrong, of Key Controls on Zinc Contaminated Deposit Dynamics in Degraded Peatlands. Brilliant topic, not something I'd ever thought about in my life. And actually, it had formulae in it that I never knew you could think about when talking about zinc in peat. And it had more Greek letters in those formulae than I knew they had in the alphabet. But actually, it was all about collecting data from various sources, analysing it, saying, this is the evidence it creates. This is what we find. And okay, it's to do with industrial revolution, modern industrial activities, historic performance and degradation of the material. Fascinating stuff if you're into that. But it took the data and produced the evidence. What it didn't do in this particular dissertation was move to action, because it was a research piece. So it painted the picture and let others draw upon it as necessary. Come to my earlier point of actually, do you want to have enough wealth to live a contented life? Well, what's the relevance of that? Well, actually, part of it is that we don't live in glorious isolation. Our wealth, to a certain extent, and our well-being depends upon the community in which we live. If we live in a really poor community, the odds are we might be still contented, but our wealth will be limited. Actually, we are all part of Guernsey, or you'll be part of a business with an employer, and actually their well-being and their profitability impacts upon you. And that's why I would say that actually there's big decisions going on in the States of Guernsey, as Sasha will have explained. The States looks after a wide range of things. Hot topics at the moment might be secondary education, and I don't know what the answer is, but it's 4, 3, 2, 2 on 1, 3 on 1 schools. I don't know what the answer is, but actually the critical thing is, what do we want? What's the product of our secondary education? Do we want people who are equipped for a particular role in life? to deliver for this island or for them as characters? What is it we want out of secondary education? The other big topic, I'm just listening to the radio this morning, is clearly the state's finances. Sounds like we're about £50 million spending out more than we're getting in. Now you can live with that for a year or two, but eventually you start running out of money, and therefore you need to find ways to address it. It's just not sustainable. Big decisions, and actually the challenge for the states of Guernsey is to get to that point of understanding what's the data, what's contributing, what's making this, what's the evidence it's showing us as to the what is happening and what are the options, and then moving to a plan of action for doing something about it. Now that's perhaps easier said than done. The other thing is actually the importance of data is that we don't rely upon the latest thing that's been earwigging us or annoying us, or whether it's the latest Twitter spat or it used to be in previous states, you'd often hear comments about what have been said in the White Rock Cafe, completely irrelevant. Actually, other times you will find that people are influenced by what they've heard at the pub, in the meat drawer, or conversation, all very interesting stuff, but actually it isn't a sound basis to make decisions. One thing you really used to bug me, because as Sash said, I've spent many years as a civil servant and seen lots of government committees work and also the states work. This is not a criticism of current states, but previous ones. One thing really wound me up. You'd get a states member who'd stand up and say, well, the Guernsey people want, or I speak on behalf of the Guernseymen. Complete hogwash. They didn't at all. They were speaking on behalf of a little pocket of people who happened to have bent their ear in a particular way. That's not how to make good decisions. Good decisions are based on sound evidence or sound data that paints you a picture that says, actually, put together, it creates this. And then you can start to say, well, if we want to achieve an outcome that's like that, how do we use that evidence to make sound decisions going forward? The final thing I'll go on to is actually clearly the states at the moment are talking about their government work plan. And that has got four main elements to it. I think it's got, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong here, but COVID, how do we get out the current COVID situation? Brexit, it hasn't gone away. We happen to have a date, but actually it's still a live issue. Recovery, economic recovery. How do we get, not just Guernsey, but in fact, we need to focus on Guernsey, but the whole world is going to have to recover from the impact of COVID. And then finally, the states have decided they want to check right sizing of government. Have we got the government of the right size? Are we doing things that we need to do or not need to do? Actually, some big things, some big challenges, and actually our part as a community is to say, if we want to be prosperous, we need the community in which we're in to be prosperous. Therefore, where we can help government in actually taking part in surveys or being positive or supporting, actually to make sure that we help provide the data, because actually Guernsey's got lots of data. Sometimes where we've got a few gaps in data when doing analysis, and you just have to try and work out how do we fill in the gaps. But data's there, the evidence is there, the states needs to move on and actually make difficult decisions, and we need to support them in so doing. Anyway, so enough of me and my culinary skills, which are pretty good actually, I hope you reckon. I will now hand over to Matthew, who'll probably take you through in a bit more technical detail about the economics and how data is useful in that realm. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Just to confirm that everybody can hear me over in Guernsey now. That's great. Thanks, Adrian, and for the introduction, and to Deputy Sasha Kazatseva-Miller for welcoming us all. I would also like to thank Lucy Kirby and Ben Ratton at the Digital Greenhouse for the invitation to speak today. All of our lives have been disrupted, and in some cases, perhaps permanently changed by the arrival of COVID-19 over the past 18 months or so. My virtual presence to deliver this keynote is evidence of that, but there are many larger and more tangible effects, from impacts on the size and role of the states to impacts on connectivity, healthcare, the environment, and many other issues. I want to explore some of those in the context of using evidence to inform the right actions. But first, it is worth remembering our world before COVID. Aside from more opportunities for travel and socializing, pre-COVID gross domestic product, effectively the tangible wealth of the island, in Guernsey had grown for 6 years in a row. However, that growth in real terms was slowing down even before COVID hit. Real GDP grew by about 1% in 2013 and 2014. It decreased to about 0.2% growth in 2015, before rebounding a bit in 2016 and 17 at around 3%, but was back down at 0.3% in 2019 before COVID hit. That translates directly into the wealth of households across the bailiwick. GDP per capita for every household, every person in Guernsey, excuse me, only managed 3% growth to the last 7 years, even before COVID hit. While clearly average incomes remain high on any global scale, slow growth in those incomes affects future prospects. It affects one of the most fundamental desires of everyone for the next generation, children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, younger people more generally, to see their quality of life improve. Incomes broadly reflect our productivity, although there are important exceptions that I'll come to, which determines our future opportunities. In common with many economies, there is a search for new growth opportunities and new ways to improve productivity, profitability, and investment. Those future opportunities will be affected by broader trends in financial services, trade, Brexit, low carbon transition, digital transition, and the demographic transition that is often characterized by an aging population. As older people take up a larger proportion of the total population because of relatively low birth rates and migration in many European and wealthier countries. Data, particularly real or close to real-time data, allows us to understand our economy and the wider environment better. To make better informed decisions, data also creates opportunities for new growth and improved well-being. Often the two come together. Better understanding of our environment helps to create economic opportunities and allows us and government to enjoy improved health and well-being. Take one example. Front did some work with a major private equity investor looking at high growth small businesses. These were defined as having a current turnover of less than £20 million per year and growth of more than 20% per year over the past 3 years. Unsurprisingly, many of those businesses are in financial and technology sectors, but there are perhaps a surprising number in wholesale and retail services and other sectors. High growth small businesses are about 3% of registered businesses in the UK, but provide nearly 8% of gross value added. They contribute nearly 3 times the amount you would expect to national wealth given their presence. In Guernsey, wholesale and retail services are the second highest growing sector over the past decade, after professional services such as accountants, lawyers, and IT solution providers. But high growth small businesses are important beyond their short run economic contribution. Our work shows how they help to drive productivity growth, which is the ultimate determiner of wealth, and provide new opportunities to replace sectors that are slowing down. Here, we use detailed firm-level data to allow us to understand not just broad macroeconomic trends, like the importance of certain types of businesses, but to drill down and understand where they are and what they are doing. This diagnostic piece can be turned into an action plan. Because we understand more about them and can talk directly to them, we can understand what they need. Indeed, based on our work, we could then comment on how best to target support for those businesses. The top issues they raised included access to premises, access to talent, to funding, and to support expanding services overseas, particularly in light of Brexit. At this point, if the technology allowed, I would share you some slides with you, but the technology is not allowing it right now, so we'll press on, I think. One of the areas with a significant growth potential is the integration of artificial intelligence that we were hearing about earlier into sectors ranging from financial services to healthcare. Artificial intelligence works, in essence, by using huge data sets to learn quickly, detect patterns, and update algorithms based on that learning. It has been central to efforts to combat COVID, where AI has been used to improve COVID testing, tasks that previously would have been done in a month. Yet AI and algorithms, while brilliant tools, are not guaranteed to deliver perfect results. We also just heard about one recent example related to the vaccination rollout. For this to be effective, the NHS had to work out how to prioritize recipients of the vaccine, such that those at the greatest risk of morbidity or serious long-term health impacts would receive it first. To do this, the NHS developed an algorithm to scour all of the national patient records and create a priority order, which ended up being largely based on age, but also took into account pre-existing health conditions. The hope was that the algorithm could be used in the bailiwick to create an equivalent priority list. As we heard, this attempt flagged up a recurring challenge for Guernsey of fragmented and uncoordinated data sources. Unlike the UK, where the NHS holds all medical records for all citizens, in Guernsey, each medical practice holds and effectively owns the data related to its own patients. Each practice stores it in its own bespoke form. When it was recognized the vaccination program would need a coordinated response, the practices agreed to allow the algorithm to be applied to their databases. However, the varying ways records were kept threw up many anomalies that the use of the NHS algorithm proved not to be a solution. Good data, kept in a consistent and safe manner, can offer real benefits to members of a community, and those benefits are often unanticipated. We didn't anticipate COVID, but better data would have helped. We are working on several business cases at the moment where we have been asked to value an investment by the public sector without knowing the precise probability that that investment will be needed. We are increasingly faced with those types of issues. How much to invest in preventative healthcare, in mitigating climate change? How much to invest in building testing capacity that might never be needed? In other words, how much do we pay for different versions of insurance in various parts of the economy? Our ability to learn as we go, update investment decisions, such as the amount of testing capacity or the configuration of wind farms, is one of the strengths of AI. Work by Frontier on AI suggests it could double the economic growth in areas at the forefront of its adaptation by 2035. Our analysis shows that increasing growth rates from embedding AI in various parts of the economy. Broadly speaking, it allows the doubling of growth, but it does vary from place to place, and achieving efficient and increased growth is not guaranteed. Taking advantage of AI to improve economic outcomes requires having the absorptive capacity to benefit from investments in AI. Absorptive capacity is a function of many things, including issues that will be examined during this week, attitudes to data security and privacy, but also having the right institutional arrangements. Underpinning the country-level results that we derived, there was also sector-by-sector analysis, looking at the ability of AI to increase output in each sector of the economy. For example, we estimated that proper adoption of AI in professional services, such as finance and accounting, could increase annual growth rates from about 2.3% to about 3.8%. As a center for finance, the links between AI and finance and the ability to take advantage of those will be important to Guernsey's future prosperity. Ensuring Guernsey is well placed to take advantage of opportunities presented by the digital transition involves action in areas like skills and also data and trust in data. Work between Frontier and the Open Data Institute has demonstrated the link between the degree to which people trust how their data will be used and their willingness to share that data. We demonstrated how willingness to share data increased as measures were taken to increase the trust in that data. Willingness to share data sits at the heart of many innovations, not just the COVID-related ones mentioned above, but also developing more energy efficient, low cost and lower carbon homes and transport, personalized financial services, and of course, online shopping and many other activities. The use of real-time data can be valuable, but can also be a little scary, and it reveals uncomfortable truths. I know this firsthand, as I was for a number of years the chief executive of the UK government's Committee on Climate Change. We were responsible for reporting to Parliament on the UK's progress against its climate commitments, and also for making recommendations where the UK was not on track. Real-time data about electricity generation, electric vehicles purchased, homes insulated, and many other areas was used to inform our analysis. We were often critical of government actions, but equally, when we demonstrated that actions were effective, that allowed government to claim credit without the usual doubts about whether the claims were true. Impartial assessment of data can be uncomfortable, but in a world that is often skeptical about facts, such an assessment often helps with credibility over time. However, it was in making recommendations that the use of data really came into its own. Tackling the threats from climate change and avoiding the worst scenarios is fundamentally about how our behaviors will change over time, not through compulsion or regulation, but because alternatives become more attractive. Electric vehicles become more attractive than conventional ones to drive. Video conferencing becomes more attractive for many situations than traveling to meetings. Alternative diets become as interesting, nourishing, and affordable as current diets. Data, AI, and learning will be at the center of allowing companies and government to respond to changing behaviors. At the Committee on Climate Change, we updated our advice annually, revising our recommendations and providing new analysis as behaviors adjusted to new circumstances. In Guernsey, facing COVID recovery and other issues, action cannot wait a full year. The use of real-time data and evaluation to inform actions starts to touch directly on some of the priorities for the new states. Managing the effects of Brexit, responding to COVID, and delivering economic and social recovery, and even right-sizing of government, would all be improved by the use of data to illustrate trade-offs, choices, and the costs and benefits of alternative actions. As I have just discussed, not solely diagnosing problems or understanding the nature of opportunities, but also to help decide on appropriate actions. This is what we call the evaluation cycle for government. Identifying a rationale for intervening, considering options, appraising those options, and then implementing the preferred one can be considerably shortened using modern methods and closer to real-time data. In our fast-changing world, where health, climate, and even, as we saw last week, European football structures can change by the minute, we increasingly have access to more and more data. The real challenge is using it to generate credible insights and to inform the right actions. For all of us in Guernsey, this includes important actions, for example, linked to connectivity, air, sea, and digital links, how each affects the demand for the other, and how they link to post-COVID patterns of tourism and the import of goods. Skills, identifying skills gaps to inform education policy, and also making apprenticeships, employment permits, and other aspects of labor supply adjust more quickly and closer to real time. Energy systems, reducing demand and shifting to more renewable sources, including potentially areas such as aviation and shipping fuels, as well as smarter homes and cars. Trade and services, including financial and other professional services, where data has long driven advice, but can now be used to understand where Guernsey can develop new, fast-growing businesses and opportunities. Because even before COVID, action in these areas was needed. And while there may be more uncertainty as we sit here today, that action is more pressing than ever. Data, evidence, action. In an uncertain world, there is even more value in making the right decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and perhaps Adrian, would you like to join me here at the front? Yes, I think Matthew has raised some really fascinating questions, right, and concerns. We talked about the importance of trust, access to data, the change of behavior. So we have a number of questions. I just wanted to remind the audience in terms of using slido.com and submitting questions. We have a couple of questions appearing, so we're going to kickstart the discussion now. But just please do submit your questions via Slido. I wanted to actually kickstart the discussion by, first of all, by I think Adrian gave a really good presentation in terms of data is everywhere, right? And there are pockets of it. And how do we mix it together to then create the recipes we want? That's really the magic composition. Well, small businesses, third sector might not have access to data, right? Or we might have access to data via different platforms. As a business, as we move online, we start using all sorts of different platforms. Sometimes they don't speak to each other. So kind of like getting started with a data economy and data-driven businesses. What would be your kind of top recommendations of how to get started?
Matthew, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, by all means. I mean, I think actually one of the difficulties with the world right now that you've illustrated very well with your statistics about data, just how much there is. And I think firms collecting lots of data, government collecting lots of data, can often be paralyzed and a bit swamped by the amount of data that they have to look at. And often, what we recommend is standing back from the masses of data that you have, trying to look at it in terms of the broad patterns that you might see in the data. If you're a consumer-facing business, look at broad patterns when and how consumers purchase your goods. Look at broad patterns, maybe related to weeks or seasons or months. If you're government, looking at labor supply, look at broad patterns of how people enter and exit the labor market and change jobs. And then once you've established some broad patterns in the data, then you can drill down to do some of the more sophisticated analysis. I think people like to talk about data science, as Adrian was saying, as sort of the new magic wand. But what you have to do first of all often is step back from the data, look at those broad patterns, and then choose which areas to dive into in more detail. I think that's the key to building the recipe and baking a successful cake, as Adrian did.
I think that's very interesting what you're talking about, Matthew, because I think what you're talking about is there's always an element of judgment. Which data should I be using? Which areas or pockets of data I want to be using? How do I put them together? Which actually inherently that creates judgment and bias, right? And we all know that if we want to prove our point, we can pick and choose the data we want, and it will clearly illustrate that, for example, discrimination legislation is costly to the business. But if I actually use a different set of data and economic modeling, I would actually, show that if, for example, this enabling discrimination legislation actually enables our community to, be fully economically and socially active. So I think, how do we deal with that issue of values entering into data science, probably at very early stages, and actually making data biased in whatever shape or form you're looking at it?
Yeah, no, and that's one of the most fraught topics right now, is making sure that we can conduct not just analysis, but also experiments in an unbiased way, and making sure that the products we developed are useful. And I think ultimately it comes down to what we often call triangulation, is that you have to look at the data from different angles, and you have to use different sources of data. And if you can support your conclusions by using 3 or 4 different sources of data, or using 3 or 4 different types of analysis, then you can be more confident about your conclusions. If your conclusions rely very heavily on one single point of data or one single source of data, then you're probably right to be a bit more skeptical about whether they're true or not. And that's the I guess the science part of data science. Is that science is eternally skeptical and questioning of the conclusions that it draws, and trying to use different methods, different forms of experiment, which we can do now increasingly in real time with data, and different forms of analyses to determine whether what the conclusion that we've reached holds up under different types of scrutiny. And that's certainly something that we're constantly trying to do in our advice to government, for example, when we were talking about issues related to labor markets and skills. If you think that there's a gap in skills in a particular area, how can we test that from different angles to establish really the case, and it really makes sense for government to act in that area?
Great. I'm going to start with questions as well. So we have the first question on the board is, given most econometric models are based on exponentially larger economies, how can we manipulate our models to take account of our unusual, small size and product mix?
Yes, well, a very good question. And you'd be surprised actually how many econometric models are based on about 30 or 40 data points. So I think Guernsey is plenty large enough to do some analysis indeed as we have in the past. But also one of the big advantages of being smaller is that you can observe the outcomes of actions much more quickly and make adjustments much more quickly. And I've worked with governments in a number of sort of island nations around the world. And the big advantage that you have is that you could try something, pilot something, observe the outcomes very, very quickly and make adjustments. You're more nimble and make adjustments more quickly. And so I would say it's a combination of, yes, using econometrics and other statistical techniques to examine the historical data and the patterns in that historical data, but also piloting and trialing things and adjusting as you go and taking advantage of the small size, which does make you much more nimble than lots of things.
Yeah, great. I think probably the management of the COVID pandemic and that reliance of data and weekly management of reaction to it was probably a good example of how we can use that. We have a question from Will Green from the Guernsey Press. With tech and data driving productivity, what's economic interaction with jobs and tax take? For example, does it mean job losses and lower tax take in places like Guernsey in the future?
Well, certainly the work that we've done both in Guernsey but also elsewhere emphasizes the fact that, as we know, there'll be parts of the economy that benefit from data and digital transition, and there will be parts of the economy that suffer and where there are jobs losses, and that's not just digital transition, but there's all sorts of changes that are happening related to COVID, related to climate, related to energy systems as well. And the really important role of government, and some of the work indeed we've done with the states in the past then, is ensuring that areas that are benefiting from digital and from data and from other aspects of economic change, where they're benefiting, that people find it easier to transition from areas where that are suffering as a consequence into those areas of the benefit. And that's partly about labor market policies, partly about skills policies, and government being able to step in the past in Guernsey. We've looked at things like apprenticeships. We've looked at in the past at things like retraining, and how do you make sure that you can facilitate the movement from sectors that are growing quickly. And I spoke about finance and technology, but also about wholesale and retail and tourism, potentially post-COVID, from sectors that can grow quickly away from sectors that are growing more slowly or indeed declining. And both government and the private sector have a big role there in ensuring that skills, labor market policies, and other related policies are linked to those changes and are adapting, as we've been speaking to, in real time in response to seeing where new opportunities are arising.
So I think you talk about the importance perhaps of just transition, isn't it? As economies and economic mixes change, we need to make sure we take the people who are affected and the businesses who are affected basically with us. We're getting quite technical questions from Mike, I think. How do you establish the confidence levels as relevant to the type of data to help ensure a decision can be made? So are you talking about confidence intervals in terms of, say, 95%, 90%, whatever?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, then as you're hinting there are formal statistical methods for establishing confidence intervals, and there are tests you can do on the data to establish whether you're 95 or 90% or 80% confident in a particular answer, and those are sort of well-established statistical tests that you can use in order to establish those intervals. But perhaps more fundamentally, and particularly in the uncertain world that we have now, that use of scenarios, that use of different ways of looking at the data and trying to look at it from different angles also establishes your confidence in a more qualitative way. And if you can replicate your results, if you can replicate the results using a different data set, and often what we do in data science with the large data set that we have is we split the data set into half or into quarters, and we do our analysis on one part of the data, and then we see whether we can replicate it on a completely different part of the data in order to increase our confidence, or indeed prove that it was a one-off, and that was not the case. And so there are different techniques, both the formal statistical ones, but also the scenario and the type of modeling techniques that we can use with different data in order to try to establish how certain we are that effects will actually, that the effects we observe are actually real.
Thank you. We have a question from a frustrated citizen, a little bit, from Rob Gregson. It is frustrating to see politicians ignore your data evidence findings. Using, for example, education in Guernsey, how could the public be given access to evidence? So I think this really touches upon the access to data by the community, by citizens. So perhaps you talked about open data as well.
How can you democratize the evidence?
Democratizing the evidence.
Figure out for themselves.
So people can figure out for themselves. I think that really accessibility of data.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Both the accessibility of data, but also, and certainly one of the things I've always tried to do, both working for the public sector as I have at times, and working for the private sector as I am now, is the accessibility of data, but also the accessibility of the analysis that was performed on the data. And so people being able to understand, we've been talking about statistical techniques, we've been talking about piloting different things, people being able to understand what processes and what changes were made to the data in order to derive certain conclusions, or in order to generate certain recommendations, having those clearly explained and set out, often in graphs or in pictures, and then such that then you can improve people's understanding, not just of the data, but of the analysis, and question it and probe it and ask the questions that need to be asked of officials and indeed of companies in order to hear their responses to those questions.
So please don't give up on scrutinizing your politicians and asking for data. But I wanted to bring something back again in. So what is not measured will not be in those data sets and analysis. And obviously we know that economic systems are based on quite old traditional type of data collection and thinking. Huge parts of the economy, such as the caring economy, for example, doesn't actually make it into GDP statistics. So we're making decisions that might influence certain parts of the population, but actually we're not taking into account those huge data and parts of the economy. So how do we address that moving forward to make sure that actually we are building economies and societies and communities that work for all, knowing that we don't capture the data? And the same goes for capturing the data on the environment, the value of the environments, of actually what nature provides to us, whether it's through natural capital accounting or so on. Unless we start understanding that value, we will not be able to put a price on it and make decisions accordingly. So how do we take into account what we currently don't value and don't capture?
Yes, this is at the forefront of lots of the work that we are doing now. And you mentioned issues of well-being, which aren't properly captured by sort of GDP issues. The sort of famous example that if we cut down loads of forests, we increase GDP, despite the fact you might think that has negative effects on broader environmental outcomes. And so one of the areas of work that's most prominent right now is, as you say, how do we value some of that? There's a huge market growing right now in carbon trading and carbon offsets to try to bring the value of carbon and of greenhouse gases into GDP and into proper measurements. Governments often use what we call shadow prices in order to make some of these decisions. And so one of the most famous ones being a quality adjusted life year. So how do we decide how much to invest in healthcare? It's not just about its impact on GDP, it's about its impact on people's well-being. And for those types of decisions, we use a quality adjusted life year. It decides between different types of actions. They're equivalent. measures of non-market goods, as we call them, in lots of parts of the economy. You're mentioning natural capital accounting as one of them. It's proven and is proving very difficult to integrate those into GDP. And so what's important is that in government making decisions, they are incorporated into the cost-benefit analysis that is taking place. Some of these non-market measures of quality of life or of environment or of other aspects of services. You can incorporate them into the analysis, both in a qualitative way and a quantitative way, and increase, of course, when people vote and when people make decisions in their lives. They aren't making them solely on the basis of income and of GDP. They are also making them on the basis, and I think politicians increasingly understand this, on the basis of how they're feeling and of what they observe. You mentioned the just transition, lots of other examples. We have a lot of work going on what's called leveling up, trying to make sure that different regions of the country are growing at equal rates. And these are all things that are being picked up in the politics today because people are voting not just on the basis of am I, in monetary terms, wealthier than I was a little while ago, but also am I in well-being, in health, in what I observe with the environment, in my interactions in parks and with nature, are all of those things also, which are important to me, also being taken account of in politics.
Great, thank you. We have another question on slide. Something we see a lot in Guernsey are surveys. Are these the best ways to collect data? What are the alternatives?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that. What are the best ways to collect data?
Surveys.
Oh, surveys,
yeah.
Surveys, yes. So surveys are a useful way to collect data, and we use them a lot. As I'm sure all of you know, the design of the survey there is quite critical, and depending on how you ask questions and what you ask, you can often get different results. And so there's a bit of science and quite a lot of art in how do you design surveys to elicit the right responses. But as economists, often what we rely on is what we call real preference as opposed to stated preference. So your stated preference is what you say you will do in the survey, but your real preference is how you actually act in your life, and those two things are often different, and so they're increasingly. That's why I was talking about piloting things, trialing things, and then observing how people actually behave in the face of evidence. So one of the things, for example, that we've done in the past is redesign accident and emergency rooms and GP offices, because it's very hard. You ask people, well, what can we do in order to reduce the stress when you arrive often sick into a hospital or into a GP, and people will say this, that, and the other thing, but whether that actually does the job is a different question. And so one of the things you can do is redesign GP offices, redesign accident emergency rooms, and then observe. Are people more stressed? Are they being seen more quickly? Are they getting less frustrated at the staff at the front of the office? There's lots of these things which previously we might not have thought of, sort of experimenting with or piloting, or increasingly we're able to do those types of things in order to collect more accurate data. But surveys still play an important role in all that as well.
Just something else again I wanted to bring into the conversation is that importance of looking at data from gender perspective. Actually, historically, it's now well documented that historically data has been collected on the male side of population, and often it's the white male as well, which has resulted in the way, for example, so many things are designed. Famously, I think there was an astronaut, was it last year, a couple of years ago, a woman, she couldn't go into space because they didn't have an emergency suit to fit her in kind of the small size to go. Same in average office temperature are set too low for women. Women feel uncomfortably, basically cold in office temperatures because actually women's average body temperatures, are higher than the men's. Seat belts are designed in a way to protect largely male bodies, so women tend to have more accidents with seat belts because they're not designed appropriately. So I think, we are actually, we're designing with gender bias because historically we've collected less data. And so I think it's important whatever we are talking about and designing, and this is going back into valuing parts of the economy which are perhaps mostly affecting women. If you look at COVID, women have been largely, more affected than, men because of their employment, because of caring responsibilities, because of schooling. So I think it's bringing in actually gender into data science is actually quite important to make sure we design equal society communities going forward. Have you taken gender into perspective in your work?
Yes. And so we've spent quite a lot of time looking at both clearly the employment issues related to gender and the lower average incomes of women and why that might be, but also, as you say, in the design of services, taking advantage of the fact that now we can access bigger data sets and try to look at them from different perspectives in order to try to ensure that it's, as you say, gender, but also race and other factors are properly taken into account in how we design goods, but then how we trial them and making sure that they work in many different circumstances. And I think business is now increasingly looking to make sure that when they launch products or when they sort of do their trial launches of products, they have a diverse community of people to test them on and to check the responses. And we're increasingly asked, obviously, to cut our data and to look at the data from those different perspectives. I think actually later on in the week, so I'm part of a double act. Instead of getting run the public policy practice, I run it with my colleague Sarah Snelson, who will be part of the roundtable on Wednesday, talking about trust in data, and that's something that she's looked at a lot as well.
Great. We have a question about kind of how can Guernsey make better use of data to support decision making, or perhaps I guess what kind of advice would you give to government today in terms of that big picture thinking to and what they need to establish in their systems and thinking to make sure we use data to support decision making?
It sounds perhaps deceptively simple, but the first thing that you do need to do is you need to be very clear about what question it is that you're asking before you even get to the data. And so in each of these areas where Guernsey has really important decisions to make, whether it's about connectivity and the sort of future of the airport and Origi and digital, or whether it's about skills that we were talking about and education policy, or about trade and Brexit related issues, or just general financial services related issues. In each of those areas where you need to start with, well, what is the question that we are trying to answer? What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve in this area? And if you can be clear about the question and clear about the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, then you use that to inform what data do we need to analyze, and how do we need to go out and surveys that we were talking about? Do we need to trial different things and test what works? But it does start with what sounds deceptively simple, but is actually very difficult. Is really what are we trying to accomplish in this particular area? And healthcare right now has thrown up some of the biggest examples, really because of COVID, but lots of debate about, is what we're trying to achieve a more responsive system to rare but very, very significant events, or are what we're trying to do with the healthcare system is respond to people's day-to-day and more predictable needs, or do we need to do both of those? And so what's the question we're asking of the system? And then use the data and the analysis to follow up with what the answer is.
So starting with the right question, asking the right questions. We have a question about A/B testing and skills. So from Rick De Beer, Sasha has talked about A/B testing. So just for information, is that splits testing you do on the website. You show two different types of website and see which one basically works better. We do this because data is not static and it needs to be interrogated all the time. Is our skill set in place to analyze it? So it's very much about skills and whether bringing values and judgment into that analysis as well. So do we have the skill set?
And that's a good question. Maybe one for the digital greenhouse to understand whether the skills exist. And certainly the work we did a few months ago around sort of skills and currency and trying to understand where the gaps are suggests that skills in some of these areas, not just in currency, in common lots placed around the world, are in short supply. And one of the things that I think every country recognizes now is there's a degree of competition for those skills. That both Sasha and myself talking about artificial intelligence and the use of skills in that area where we can do lots of work. There's a huge degree right now of international competition for people who have skills in the data science, in the website design, in the testing of websites. And I think one of the things that currency needs to decide is where and when you need to attract those people to currency, develop them from the students who are currently attending school in currency, and where is it that you could use people who are located outside currency to deliver some of those. But a skills strategy that again starts with the question: where are the opportunities for us as currency in the future? What is our competitive advantage? Where are we trying to push things forward? And then, having identified those areas, then how do we adjust our labor market policy, our skills policy, our education policy, consistent with those aspirations? I think is precisely where we want to be.
Great. We just have another question coming. Actually, a couple of late coming questions coming in. Are there any new growing areas of data science driving insight for government and private sector? Anything you can share in terms of innovation and data science?
Well, the use of data science combined with to understand people's behaviors is one of the important growing areas, and in particular, its use in real time to make adjustments to goods and services. So we've seen how, and Sasha will know as better than me, sort of on Booking.com, but on lots of service websites where you're using the data in real time to make adjustments to what people are being offered, and indeed in real time to adjust services and to adjust production and manufacturing plants. And one of the things we've seen and are seeing right now, for example, with the rollout of electric vehicles, is using data in real time to decide where charging points need to be located in order to make them as convenient as possible for people, to inform where we need to make investments in network reinforcement as well. And so I think some of that link between data and real-time decision making and action is where we see lots of progress happening now.
Great. Still lots of questions coming in, so I think the audience is really warming up to Q&A. We have a few more minutes, so I'll keep going with the questions. How do we increase the competency of decision makers to make data-driven decisions? Is it really about training? Is it about mindset, or is it maybe about even culture in businesses and governments?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and I think it does. I think you have to recognize that the individuals in different parts of whether it's companies or government need different types of skills to incorporate data into their lives. And so some people need to understand the detailed statistical techniques or econometric techniques that we were talking about earlier, or indeed programming techniques, data science techniques, in order to use the data. But other people need the skills to be able to question the results, to be able to understand, have you tested it in this way? Have you looked at it from this angle? To probe and to inquire. Right? The danger is that we feel that sort of everybody needs all the technical skills. Some people need the technical skills, but that other people, that you can sort of participate in this data-driven, digitally driven economy in other ways as well, and making sure that people have the skills to question and to probe and to ask of people generating the results as well. And that's as valuable, if not more valuable, than some of the very technical skills that clearly are often.
So I think that means really everyone needs to have the skills to be able to deal with the data economy. It's not just certain data scientists, hidden away in a data lab that make data decisions, isn't it? It's everyone, from scrutiny, from design, etc. So great. So I think we have a last question. You mentioned carbon offsets and carbon pricing. Are there any other ways that certain qualitative issues, like environment, are being quantified? Although I would argue, actually, you can make environment quite quantitative as well. Yeah. So, are there any other ways to quantify what is currently not quantifiable?
Yes, and we were talking about natural capital accounting, which is another way to try to put value on biodiversity, on the sort of richness of or otherwise soil, things like that. And so the key with all of these sort of non-market ways of quantifying outcomes is to try to identify what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve with that good. You know, are we trying to achieve improved quality of life? Are we trying to achieve increased biodiversity? Are we trying to achieve different outcomes when it comes even to people's social interactions? So we were mentioning how we found through COVID that all whole aspects of the caring economy are probably undervalued, and the social interactions that we have between each other undervalued. And thinking in terms of how can we attach a value to those in ways that the market might fail to do in some instances, and looking for proxies, again, looking for how people behave. So the fact that people are willing to spend so much time socializing attests to its importance above and beyond how much someone might pay in order to do that. And then trying to quantify some of those using a range of techniques in order to incorporate them into analysis, and recognizing that sometimes you can't put a quantitative number on it, but you can add that qualitatively to the analysis. And a lot of sometimes what we do in the business cases is say, well, what would you need to believe in order to invest X amount in this? And if what you would need to believe is sort of eminently reasonable and a quite conservative view of what you think the actual benefits might be, then you might not need to prove the precise return on investment, but you can just demonstrate that what you would need to believe for this investment to be worthwhile is something that would broadly be acknowledged to be true, and you can proceed on that basis. So it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative evidence that you bring to some of these more sort of non-market outcomes.
Fantastic. Well, unless there are any more burning questions, I wanted to thank our speakers today, and again, Lucy's team for organizing. So thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the week. So thank you. Thanks, Wonderful.
Thank you very much.